21 Keys to Unlock a Basic Understanding of World War II. 1. The Treaty of Versailles, June 28, 1919. A vengeful treaty imposed upon Germany at the end of World War I by the Allied powers, including the United States, France, and Britain, requiring the Germans to give up all the land they had conquered during World War I and holding them financially and morally responsible for the total cost of the war. This treaty was meant to be a punishment upon Germany and created a brutal environment which generated people like 2. Adolf Hitler, born 20 April 1889. Hitler was a decorated German soldier during World War I, was burned and almost blinded in the trenches, and felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles. After being thrown in jail following a failed attempt to take control of the government, he wrote out his plan in a book. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, describes his hatred of Jewish people and the need to create Lebensraum, or living space, for the superior German race. By 1933, Hitler's National Socialist Party, known as the Nazis, held a large portion of the elected offices in the German government, and to rid himself of competition for control of Germany, Hitler killed his political rivals in what is known as 3. Night of the Long Knives. Hitler's willingness to kill his political rivals was perfectly in line with his vision of a new order, in which Germany was supreme. Hitler took dictatorial control of Germany using secret police and other violent tactics. To create his vision of order, he would rid the world of all opposition to it. During World War II, this would lead eventually to a final solution, which meant killing off all undesirable people in death camps such as Auschwitz and Birkenau, Jewish people being the primary target. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops only blocks away, Hitler shot himself. 4. Appeasement. On 24 September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Adolf Hitler, who was demanding lands which were taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. After the shocking and devastating level of death in World War I, the people of Britain and France wanted more than anything to avoid another war. And so, Chamberlain agreed to Hitler's demands. More importantly, this meeting revealed to Hitler that the Western Allies were weak and not prepared for another fight. 5. Japan invades China. On July 7th, 1937, on the other side of the world, the Empire of Japan, having already taken control of Manchuria, began a series of victories over China, taking control of key strategic points, such as Shanghai and the capital Nanking. By 1939, having extended their control deep inland and facing increasingly effective resistance, the fighting reached a stalemate, and Japan would expand its territorial ambitions elsewhere beyond China. 6. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Back in Europe, in a stunning turn of political relations, Hitler and Stalin agreed to invade Poland. Previously mortal enemies, They agreed to split the conquered lands between the two countries and then exist in a state of non-aggression. In the 1930s, engaged in a proxy war with each other, supporting each side in a Spanish Civil War, they were mortal enemies. This non-aggression pact stunned the world. Hitler represented fascism in Germany, and Stalin represented communism in the Soviet Union. These two ideologies were diametrically opposed, and yet they had agreed to a non-aggression pact. This détente, or peace, between sworn enemies shocked the world. 7. The invasion of Poland. On August 31st, 1939, both the Germans and the Soviets launched their military invasion against Poland as previously agreed upon, with the conquered lands being divided between the two powers, providing each a buffer zone to support the non-aggression pact. This conquest also freed Hitler to turn Germany's full might away from the East against the Western Allies, France and Britain. Hitler also used the invasion of Poland as an opportunity to test his new military strategy. 8. Blitzkrieg. With the Eastern Front secured through the non-aggression pact with Stalin, Hitler turned and focused all his military forces on the Western allies of France and Britain. To ensure that his forces would not be bogged down in trench warfare, as was the case in World War I, Hitler used a high concentration of powerful tanks known as panzers and other motorized vehicles and mechanized infantry, supported by heavy and tight air power support, to break through the enemy's fortified lines. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched an invasion of France. The Blitzkrieg worked perfectly, and after 6 weeks, France was forced to surrender, while Britain was forced to abandon a significant amount of their military equipment on the beaches of France and make a harrowing escape thanks to a civilian-led flotilla of all small boats that could cross the channel, saving around 300,000 troops from the port of Dunkirk. 9. The Battle of Britain. Having crushed opposition on mainland Europe, Hitler needed to get Britain to end any threat from the West. However, the British Royal Navy was superior to Germany's naval forces, and so an amphibious invasion was not possible. Instead, Hitler was convinced he'd use his air forces, the Luftwaffe, to bomb Britain into surrender. From the 10th of July 1940 until the 11th of May 1941, Germany bombed the island of Britain from the air in an event known as the Blitz. Unfortunately for Germany, the British were never going to surrender thanks to the English Channel and the leadership of one man, Winston Churchill. Born into the British aristocracy, his father was a lord and his mother an American socialite. Churchill rose quickly and during World War I held the position of First Lord of the Admiralty until a disastrous attempt to break the war's stalemate through the Turkish Straits led to 120,000 British casualties. To redeem himself, Churchill joined the British Army in the trenches. During the 1930s, Churchill warned about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis and was dismissed as a warmonger. after the failed policy of appeasement, on the day Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, on the 10th of May, 1940, the same day Germany launched its Blitzkrieg invasion of France, Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain and gave his acceptance speech, which is often considered among the greatest speeches in history, vowing that Britain would never surrender. 11. Operation Barbarossa. Having failed to force Britain to surrender through air power, but using U-boats or submarines to strangle Britain's food supplies, Hitler turned his land forces and his attention back to the East and the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, with over 600,000 motorized vehicles, 3.5 million troops, Hitler broke the peace pact he'd only recently signed with Stalin and launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans had murderous success in the early part of the invasion, making it all the way to the doorstep of Moscow. However, because Hitler had split his forces into 3 separate attack groups, they each lacked sufficient power to complete their objective, and then the Russian winter came and froze the German army half to death. The counterattack, ordered by the steely leader of the Soviet Union, would finish the rest. 12. Joseph Stalin, born December 18th, 1878. Joseph Stalin was among the young leadership that took control of Russia during the Russian Revolution made possible by the destruction of World War I. When Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the communists that controlled Russia, died, Joseph Stalin emerged as the new leader. In the 30s, Stalin, a word that means steel in Russia, began a reign of terror, ridding himself of any and all competitors for leadership, effectively becoming a dictator. Over 80% of all German casualties during the war came in their battle with the mighty Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Hitler had run into a man who was at least as murderous and ruthless as he was. 13. The attack of Pearl Harbor. While the United States remained neutral as Europe destroyed itself, in order to slow the growing power of Japan in Eastern Asia, the United States used its position in the Philippines to cut off Japan's access to key industrial resources, specifically oil. In a bold move, the Japanese devised a plan to deliver a knockout blow to the United States naval forces in the Pacific, extending their existing technology beyond what was thought possible. The Japanese used aircraft carriers and the world-class Mitsubishi Zero fighter airplanes to launch a sneak attack on the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor, located on the Hawaiian Islands. The attack sank 4 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, destroyed 180 aircraft, and killed 2,400 Americans. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the U.S. aircraft carriers were out at sea and no submarines were destroyed, and these were the 2 naval weapons the United States would use to counter Japan's attack, behind the leadership of one man. 14. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born January 30th, 1882. During World War I, Franklin Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary to the Navy. Well on his way to greatness, in 1921, Roosevelt was stricken by polio, leaving his legs paralyzed. He persevered and returned as the governor of New York, and in 1932 was elected President of the United States, tasked with pulling the United States out of the Great Depression. He said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." The only president to serve more than 2 terms, the second half of his presidency was spent fighting World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he gave his greatest speech, beginning with December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. In April 1945, with victory in sight, Roosevelt died in office. 15. The Battle of Midway. Only 6 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, the decisive battle in the Pacific would be fought between ships that were out of sight of each other. The Battle of Midway was a battle between aircraft carriers. The Japanese thought if they could get one more major blow to the American Pacific Fleet, the U.S. would surrender. However, because the Americans had broken the Japanese communication codes, the Battle of Midway would be an ambush upon the Japanese. Japan suffered 4 aircraft carriers sunk, 248 aircrafts destroyed, and 3,000 killed. These were losses the Japanese were not able to replace. 16. The Battle of Kursk. In July 1943, the Germans launched an attack on Kursk. The German plans to attack were intercepted by British intelligence, and the Soviet Union was able to prepare extensive defenses, including minefields and anti-tank weaponry. Soviet losses during the battle were significantly higher, 250,000 to 50,000 killed, 6,000 tanks destroyed to 800 German tanks destroyed. But like the Japanese, Germany could no longer replace their losses. This was the last battle in which the Germans were on the offensive against the Soviets. 17. The Strategic Bombing Campaign. For the same reason that the Germans could not invade Britain, Britain and the United States could not easily invade mainland Europe. The English Channel acts as an ocean wall. Luckily, Boeing was manufacturing an amazing flying machine of death, the B-17 heavy bomber known as the Flying Fortress. Because dropping a bomb from one of these planes while under attack from anti-aircraft fire is extremely inaccurate, the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Corps relied on mass formations of these planes, all dropping large amounts of munitions. In certain cases, the amount and type of bombs dropped could burn nearly an entire city. While this saturation bombing proved effective in the destruction of industrial capacity, the collateral damage in terms of lives included hundreds of thousands of civilians, making this wartime action very controversial. 18. The D-Day invasion. Having softened the defenses in France through strategic bombing, and with the majority of German military forces fighting the Soviets in the east, the Western Allies, led by the United States, invaded mainland Europe. On June 6, 1944, or D-Day, the landings on the beaches of Normandy, France, launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. The end result was 5 Allied beachheads, through which the rest of the Allied forces could land and be supplied. The cost was 185 Sherman tanks and 10,000 dead on the beach. 19. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. On October 23, 1944, in possibly the largest naval battle in history, the Imperial Japanese Navy was mostly destroyed by the United States Navy. Notably, this was the first battle in which desperate Japanese pilots carried out organized kamikaze suicide attacks. In these attacks, the pilots would fly their planes loaded with bombs directly into naval vessels. Thanks to this victory, and many more on land, American General Douglas MacArthur was able to keep his famous promise to return to the Philippines. 20. The Yalta Conference. In February of 1945, with Allied victory over Germany and Japan only months away, the big three leaders of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, held a meeting in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula to decide how the world would be divided among the victors. The agreements these leaders made were far less important than the military realities on the ground. In Europe, there was a race to conquer as much of Germany as possible, because that would truly decide which powers controlled which territory. The belated D-Day invasion allowed the Western Allies to reach the center of Germany, and thus after the war there was an East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union, and a West Germany, controlled by the United States. Likewise, in Asia, military presence decided the division of lands previously controlled by Japan, with North and South Korea allied with each of the different sides. Because Britain had been so diminished by both World War I and World War II, Winston Churchill kinda just showed up and photobombed the real powers. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, and Franklin Roosevelt, leader of the United States. 21. The atomic bomb. While the Soviet Union had a far larger army on the field in Europe and had suffered 27 million casualties in the war, doing the majority of the fighting against the Germans, the United States had one very important advantage in deciding the shape of the post-war world: the atomic bomb. Thanks to a letter signed by Albert Einstein on June 28, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8807, beginning a program to develop a bomb using nuclear fission. At 5:30 on the 16th of July, 1945, in the deserts of New Mexico, at the Trinity site, the Manhattan Project, as it came to be known, successfully detonated the first atomic weapon. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States detonated 2 nuclear weapons over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing at least 129,000 people. Ending the war, it was President Harry Truman that ordered the bombs to be dropped, after having received intel that it would have taken 1 million American lives to invade the main island of Japan. However, the need to use this new superweapon is still debated to this day.
If in the minds of the younger generation